I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Arshad, Dr. Suhail Naqvi before him, and the rest of my colleagues here who've been instrumental in sort of supporting our work over the last year. I'd like to next request Melinda Good, who is the operations manager for the Pakistan Country Program at the World Bank, to perhaps give us a bit of a summary of the report and maybe other thoughts that you might have on the broader agenda of Pakistan 100. Thanks.
I think so. First, because this is a collaboration, I'm going to do this in tag team with my colleague Shabih. And because it is a collaboration, let me also say thank you to our colleagues at LUMS, to the Vice Chancellor, to the founder, to Ali, who's really been an intellectual leader with this. And of course, my colleagues at the bank. I don't claim intellectual ownership of any part of this, but I and all of my colleagues do these talks from time to time because we think it's very, very important that all of us have internalized the question that is Pakistan at 100. So I'm going to borrow from the Vice Chancellor's speech as I begin the talk. And the idea here, by running through the presentation, really is to spark a dialogue with all of you, and a dialogue that I think continues over time. And we'll start with the panel and then keep going. But let me start with a question. Sort of as we talk about this in different forums, we start in different ways. Since we're in a school, in a law school, I'm a lawyer by training as well as a public policy person. Let me ask the backbenchers. Is there anyone here who was born in 1981 or earlier? Can you raise your hand? Sorry, later. I mean later. 1981 or later. I was thinking of myself. There we go. That's what I wanted. Okay. Why am I asking 1981? So the topic of this report is Pakistan at 100, Shaping the Future for 2047. So that's 28 years from now. Was anybody born in 1981? You all may be younger than that. Okay. Somebody who was born from 1981 to now, that's the span of time we have left when we start to talk about the key policy choices and reforms. This is the question the report is asking, thanks to the collaboration with all the folks at LUMS and with DFID and others. This is the question. What is this country that we're imagining in 2047? And that's the time it took all of you to first go to school, to fight, and I know you must have fought hard to get to be studying or teaching at a prestigious university like this. This is the amount of time left. So that's the question. What is this country we're envisioning? Now I think I have to click. Am I right? There. Okay. So why do we have this picture? These kids were obviously born after 1981. So this is a picture when we did the first version of this launch was in Islamabad last Monday. And that day, one of our colleagues went to the hospitals sort of not too far away and said, can we meet some kids who were born today? So these two twins were born a week ago in Islamabad. And they show up here, and they're going to show throughout the presentation. Because the idea is to think about, again, for those of us who are in sort of, further along in our careers, everybody in the front of the room, what are we needing to do now to help support a different, a very, very visionary future for Pakistan? And what do all of you who are in the back, who may be starting to have kids of your own, or someday will, what do you need to do now to get to that future? So what are we talking about? What's really the question here? Again, this is sort of a vision of sort of families and transport now and in the future. This is Karachi now and potentially in the future. Okay, so this chart. So first we have to look a little bit back to the past. Why are we even asking this question now? Like what is it that needs to be different? So if you look at this chart, and again, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer and a public policy student, but what this chart tells you, I don't know if you can see it from far away, so you can also feel free to walk up and look. So if you look in the 1960s, Pakistan was a stellar performer. Pakistan was a leader in growth. It was a leader in investment in human capital. This is China, India, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Turkey. So if you look in 1960, the only country that was growing at a faster rate than Pakistan was Korea. Then if you look what happened, over time, everybody else got ahead. We all like competition. We all play whatever our sports are. Or maybe our sport is sort of being the best in our academic work. So what's happened over time is others have gotten ahead. So this is the first question. What can happen now so that Pakistan can get back up ahead. Because if you look over time, there's been up and down. I mean, over the decades, there's been sort of ups and downs in the global economy. But the trajectory has been that everybody else has gotten ahead and Pakistan's gotten behind. Now, why does this matter now? Why are we talking about this now? Part of it is that we sort of, to visualize this, we've run a simulation of two different trajectories. And if you look at the cover page of the report, you can see there's sort of a red line and a green line. One scenario is sort of business as usual, because things are not terrible for most of us in Pakistan. And in fact, I should say, so I moved back to Pakistan 18 months ago. And before that, I used to travel around the country a lot, right at the turn of the century. And in that time, Pakistan halved its absolute income poverty rate. Now, Hans and I were just talking about this. You were also here 15 or so years ago, right? When I moved back, it was very, very apparent to me that absolute income poverty had reduced. I didn't need analysis, I didn't need data. I could see my own data, I could see. But it was also apparent to me that that reduction was not equitable. It was not evenly spread, okay? So if things go on as usual, how are you going to get to sort of the more equitable, the faster growth rate? So the red line is a simulation showing if the investment rate continues as it is, if the population rate continues to be the highest in the region, the economy may grow, but it's not going to grow much differently than it has over the last 40 years. And then when you're comparing yourself to other countries, your trajectory will be the same. The green line shows that if now tough policy choices are made so that the investment to GDP ratio increases, the population growth rate, is reduced so that there can be healthier, smaller families, so that families can invest more in their kids. And this is an interesting, Enrique, so the lead author, and Wahid said, this is very, very simple. If you have fewer kids, that it decreases the dependency ratio. It increases the savings rate for all of us who are parents or in charge of kids in our lives, or all of you who will have kids. That increases the investment rate, and then you grow. It's simple, and yet it's something we need to talk about now. So with sustained reforms, and this is the headline number in the report, that if you look on LUMS' own website, or on our website, or the articles that have been in the Dawn recently, this is what it's talking about. With sustained reforms, a $2 trillion economy is possible in 2047. It's a huge change. So how do we get there? That's the harder part. I'm going to eventually turn over to my colleague Shabih. But the next question, going back to what the Vice Chancellor said, what are these questions we're asking? Is this possible? Have others done it? So this is a graph. I think it's in your report too if you can't see it, which shows that in other countries, sort of the peer countries, the comparator countries, this has been done in a generation. So Korea took 19 years. China took 15 years. Not easy, but not impossible. Now, before I turn it over to Shabih, this is sort of the outline of the report. So we use the Growth Commission structure to organize the questions. And in fact, it was about a year ago, right, Ali, that we had the debates here. I had just moved here, and we had debates along these 7 themes. So one is around accumulation. How do we invest more and more strategically in people? Public and private investment. How do we create the fiscal space to be able to make more investments by the public sector? And how does the private sector kind of find the space to be more creative, to grow the economy in different ways? And then on allocation, this means, again, changing the way, the incentives and the way that the economy moves. And then trade and regional connectivity. Now here I have a prop, which then I'm going to hand over to Shabih. We were talking about this today. So this is a quinoa, right? This kind of orange that's in Pakistan. It grows in my yard. We're talking about it because I'm also from Florida. So we have this theme. One of the themes is about Pakistan goes global, right? Like, why do we not see products from Pakistan around the world? This is fabulous. It's sweet. It's easy to peel. And in my home state, I spend tons of money for the kids buying these easily peelable little oranges that are marketed as cuties. So what would it do? Why am I not buying these? They're much better. But I can only eat them here. My family's never tasted them. So what will it take to have Pakistan go global? I'm going to throw this to you because then Shabih's going to use it later. Okay, and then finally, sustainability, environment and inclusion. Now, I think one question that the panel may need to think about is, if you look at if I go back a slide and look at the comparator countries that have also made this transition over 15 years, not all of them did this with sustainability of the environment in mind. But I think as you look into the report, you understand why it's so important for Pakistan now to be making these decisions in a way that uses your resources wisely. And then inclusion, which takes me back to the way I started, my observation when I moved back about, there's been reduction in absolute poverty, but is it as inclusive and prosperous as it could possibly be in 2047? So I did the easy part to kind of give the overview. Shabih, I think, now is going to take us through just a couple of themes, because it's a really rich discussion. Many of you are the authors of these pieces, so you know how rich it is. But as we've gone out and sort of talked about this in the newspapers and in other venues, the idea, I think, was to pick sort of 7 or 8 key topics to talk about and get people debating. Yeah. Let me hand you the clicker.
Thank you. I think I'll hear me. Yeah.
Switch to him.
The Growth Commission's framework, looking at successful countries, single generation success stories, what have they done, right? So this is also what other countries do. Other successful countries, China has done some exercise on what is the future of the economy. Vietnam does it. So this is also what Pakistan is thinking about. So the question is, we've talked about the $2 trillion economy, but what do we do over the next 5 years that will essentially get us into that glide path that takes us up? So what I share with you is some of the specific recommendations. We've got a whole panoply of things. So what are the things to focus on? One of the things is about the fertility question that Melinda talked about. In the 80s, there used to be this campaign, "Do bache hi achhe." I think it's time to bring it back and get it done, right? Because you have the denominator, you have the numerator, GDP per capita goes down, GDP per capita will go up, right? You talked about the equity and inequity of education. We feel that stunting is a big problem, right? Because the first 1,000 days determines whether or not this child will actually be able to absorb stuff. And the funny thing about Pakistan is stunting rates are also sort of 25% in the top decile. So it's not just a poor's problem. It's a problem that sort of like is much more systemic. So that's something to think about, right? And this has all been done. Peru has done a great job. So this question really is, how does one come on and do these kind of high bandwidth type of interventions, which are not just about throwing money into things like education and stuff without thinking through the production function, the ability to absorb. So 2 things, right? Then essentially the question is, what can Pakistan do on the accumulation side when it's looking at capital investments, etc., prosperity? So 2 messages: collect more, spend better, right? So on the collect more, the question, everybody knows about this revenue challenge, right? Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio is one of the lowest in lower income countries. Question is, how do you take it up to 18% of GDP? And we think it's possible. The question about the FBR reform, people are talking about. It's high on the agenda. What do you do? Pakistan needs to sort out its GST. It's actually one of the countries that stands out as an outlier on how GST is fragmented across the 4 provinces and the federation. It just doesn't work. Companies have to put in 60 different tax returns with no write-offs and no unified ways of which you're trying to do sort of like data sharing and stuff. It just doesn't happen. On FBR transformation, it's a mishmash. It's not a functional organization. It's a territorial organization. It's not hierarchical. It doesn't do data. So just sort that out. Right, and you have like 5 areas. We talked about going into functions, be much more data intensive. So collect more, spend better. Pakistan does, when you look at global comparisons, Pakistan manages to sort of implement the same type of a project in about 3-4 more years than other countries. So the 1 year you waste, the economic costs are quite a lot. How do you sort it out? Better appraisals, better project preparation, better operations and maintenance. Pakistan does budgeting in 2 different sort of pots. Capital current doesn't work, can be sorted out. Countries that Melinda showed was going up did this. Possible. Nothing's in the impossibility frontier. We define the fiscal space as expenditures net of interest payments and defense, and you can see Pakistan's fiscal space is fairly limited. That's why we are looking at the revenue challenge. Please feel free to jump in with other thoughts. And so then we are talking about the business regulation. You spend better, you do more, you have better projects. Businesses that are operating in a single province, this is a single province in a certain industry, essentially have to go for 40 agencies that are administering more than 1,500 essentially regulations. The result is it's more profitable to put money into real estate. Why do business, right? So that's a big issue. The interesting thing that we did was when you're looking at the export challenge, if Pakistan had maintained its share of exports at 2005 level, and then you look at the growth in exports, Pakistan should have been exporting $103 billion worth of exports, right? So the question then is, what is the issue? The issue is an overvalued exchange rate, right, which essentially over the decade led to deindustrialization, and services is not working out because of the GST stuff, and also Pakistan's tariff structure. The import tariff structure is such that it has a lot of anti-export bias. So when you look at the top, when you look at finished goods, high tariffs, intermediate goods, lower tariff, inputs, very little tariffs. Essentially, this means that the effective protection for local companies is very high. The result is that companies mostly just get inputs cheap, they put them together and transfer price, they sell it in the local market, they don't export. So this whole paradigm of let's get cheaper manufacturing and then we'll sell it abroad has not worked in any country. And when you plot countries' income levels and their dependency on external taxes, on trade taxes, very low. So the question is, how does one sort of harmonize the tariff policy? Fairly straightforward, it's possible. So going to water, to sustainability theme, as you know, Pakistan essentially uses 80% of its water on crops that generate 5% or less of GDP. There's no price, water pricing is not particularly sort of like cost effective. There's no way to measure water, so it's not about just jacking up prices, but the question is how do you monitor water usage, and how do you actually also stop giving subsidies which are quite regressive in nature, and they get people to essentially have water intensive crops and then sell to government at controlled prices, right? So move to higher value added, and this is where you want to get this little guy to the market. Melinda already mentioned that poverty has fallen, but inequality is an issue, and inequality has been a major challenge. And essentially, when you look at most economies, inequality deteriorates, and the question is that what can you do about it, right? So this is where I think Pakistan has an advantage. It has secondary cities. It's not like East Asia has a primate city and the rest of the territory, but Pakistan has multiple cities. How do you actually then use that to an advantage, connect with markets, and do much more equitable resource allocation over space, and to actually deliver better resources across space? So we did this World Development Report on economic geography that looks at some of the successful countries and what kind of economic geography and what kind of sort of space it has. So We feel that it's better to provide services at good quality across space, even though the production base could be concentrated. I'm stopping soon, so it's not going to go too long. And finally, the question is, people say, but we all know this, right? You know the tax system needs to be overhauled. You know the exchange rate's not an issue, maybe perhaps as in your view. The tariff policy is an issue. But the question is, why doesn't it happen? Right? Why doesn't intelligent people, everybody, Pakistan is very intelligent bureaucracy. Why doesn't it happen? Our view is elite capture. Elite capture has people have captured, the small have captured the economy. They've also captured policy making, and that's where essentially citizens' voices are not being heard. So the question then is, what do you do on having less elite capture and more sort of competition over space? We feel that transparency is hugely important. If you don't know, you don't know. And then essentially the local government accountability is something which will be very good to think through more as the 18th Amendment sort of like goes through and essentially like local governments are put together. What kind of local government system could be there that gives local citizens accountability? We feel that going into a virtuous cycle where you got like voters which are essentially providing you feedback and government listening and policymakers doing the larger good is something that will be useful to think through a bit more. Two big areas where we want to highlight the subsidies part is that Pakistan is spending about 1.5% of GDP on subsidies to SOEs. They benefit probably like 500,000 or 0.75 million people, while Pakistan is only spending about 0.9% of GDP on healthcare, which is for maybe 207 million people. So the question is thinking through some of these sort of like numbers, because these are coming from taxes mostly, right? So people are paying taxes, everybody's paying taxes because most of them are coming from the services side. The direct tax system is not really doing much. Indirect taxes are regressive. So the poor are paying more, they're not getting much, subsidies are going to the SOEs. So that's very much it. Then the question was, how do you actually think through kind of like a cycle where your average growth rate over the last decade has been about 3.7%. We thought it will be really good to think through specific targets for that for the year 2023 because that also ties in well with the political cycle. So what we say is that in the baseline, if you could avoid having balance of payments crisis every 3 to 5 years, 3 to 4 years, 5 years, it will be a good thing, right? So without macro stability, ain't gonna happen. We talked about the revenue increase from 8 to 18%, ease of doing business, more credit to the private sector. We're talking about trade. We're talking about better innovation in firms. We're talking about reducing subsidies to SOEs, as well as having interventions that reduces the stunting rates. And if you hopefully be able to, through these kind of targets, the growth rate would essentially be around 6 to 7%. Investment would be around 25 to 30%. Currently, investment rates in Pakistan are about 9 to 10%. Yeah, Zara, is it 9 to 10% right now? Yeah, okay. So these are sort of reforms that will help improve productivity and essentially also hopefully reduce the growth rate of population to a little bit less than it is today. I'll stop here, but to say that this is possible. None of these reforms that we said are technically not possible. Question is, how do we collectively come together so that it's not a story about you, me, but it's a story of us that actually provides a better future for those two kids that Melinda talked about. The reason why we also want to focus on the kids is because if the economy does well for these guys, it'll do well for you. Thank you.